Hey gang, what's good? Welcome to another Morrowind Mechanics guide. This time we're covering NPC dispositions and using persuasion. Before we get started though, let me say that this guide covers strictly disposition and persuasion. We'll touch on things like mercantile and illusion spells, but they'll each have their own dedicated guides later on in the future. Anyways, when you look under the hood, Morrowind features, arguably, the most complicated persuasion system of any Elder Scrolls game. But thankfully, in practice, it hardly requires any memorization on the player's part. We'll be covering both the basics and the more intricate minutiae, so, as always, feel free to use the timestamps I've put together if you want to skip right to something very specific. Your first introduction to the Speechcraft system is a little funky. Rather than a tutorial, Morrowind instead offers you a warning to just not experiment with the system unless you're experienced or confident. So, let's briefly go over the fundamentals. When you open a dialogue menu with an NPC, you'll see their current disposition towards you, as represented by a blue gauge in the top right corner. This gauge ranges from 0 to 100, and NPC's disposition towards you affects a few but sometimes important things. The first and most frequently used case is that merchants and NPCs who provide services will usually charge you less gold when they have higher dispositions. Extremely low dispositions can result in NPCs refusing services to you and refusing to speak with you at all. Conversely, very high dispositions can result in some NPCs divulging more information or key items to you that you may otherwise have needed to steal, purchase, or kill to complete a quest. This is typically relevant in quests that involve you dealing with less than savory characters, or those of opposing factions. Now that we know the purpose of dispositions, let's look at how they're calculated. Starting base disposition is calculated using your personality attribute. 50 personality points are considered the base and translate into a disposition of 50 for the majority of NPCs. From this base of 50, every 2 points of personality above or below will increase or decrease dispositions by 1 point, using this formula. Mind you that half points of disposition aren't used. Now, although personality through leveling caps out at 100, spell effects can raise it further. Keep this in mind if you ever run across any bottles of telvanni bug musk, which always provides a 20-point boost to dispositions while active. Just like all other potions or alcoholic drinks, this effect does stack for each bottle consumed. Anyhow, the next major impact to NPC dispositions is your character's faction and faction rank relative to an NPC's faction, that is, if the NPC even belongs to one. Unfortunately, I found two conflicting formulae used to calculate the faction modifier. They're both on screen now. The result of this formula is added to your previously calculated disposition. I should point out that I do have reason to believe that the former is correct, and that the latter is using potentially outdated information. But as always, I do think it's good practice to just have it all out there anyways, just in case. Anyways, fortunately for us, they're both rather similar, and we can derive pretty much the same meaning from them. Now, before we take a look at each faction's reaction to one another, allow me to give you a warning. If you're averse to spoilers regarding in-game factions, then look away now. Audio is spoiler-free, but I'll give you the all-clear when we're through with the spoilery visuals. Okay, on screen now are a couple of handy tables from the folks at uesp.net, featuring all of the factions in the game and their respective ranks. I should point out that some of these factions the player cannot join and are reserved exclusively for NPCs. Anyhow, using this, you can determine the reaction amongst factions in the game. When it comes to calculating reactions, if you and an NPC share a faction, then that same faction takes precedence in the formula. Otherwise, NPCs will always use whatever faction you belong to that they hate the most. Many of the faction reactions make sense if you're following in-game dialogue and story. For example, factions that represent or support Morrowind's local culture are typically at odds with factions that represent or support imperial influence and gentrification. Okay, we're out of spoiler territory now. The last significant impact to your dispositions is your current bounty. However, there isn't a universal modifier. Instead, individual NPC reactions to your bounty level depends on their own personal relations with the law. Generally speaking, it's safe to assume fellow criminals are likely to shrug off your own criminal record. Now, let's cover a couple smaller impacts to dispositions and dispel a few common misconceptions while we're at it. These can be important to keep in mind if you're trying to edge a disposition just far enough over a certain threshold. Mind you that because of how the formulae involved function, persuasion attempts are usually more successful on NPCs who have their dispositions around 50. We'll go over the specifics of those formulae in a bit, but for now, let's keep in mind that being diseased lowers a disposition by 10, having your weapon out lowers it by 5. Being the same race as an NPC also gives you a 5-point disposition bonus. You'll get the most out of this if you're a Dark Elf or a Nord, being as they're plentiful in Morrowind and Solstheim, but it's not really worth basing your race decision around just a 5-point bonus. There's also a few ways to temporarily increase dispositions through spell effects. You can cast Charm on NPCs to raise their disposition by the magnitude listed on the spell's tooltip. Don't worry, using Charm on friendly NPCs won't turn them hostile. Fortifying your own personality also does the job. Forewarning though, fortifying your Speechcraft won't affect dispositions. We'll go more into that later on. One last piece of very handy advice regarding these spells is that they really only need to have durations of about 1 or 2 seconds, because all passage of in-game time is paused whenever you open menus. This includes dialogue menus. Now, contrary to popular belief, your character's reputation and quality of clothing do not impact the dispositions of NPCs. Higher value clothing does elicit NPCs commenting on your character, but there's no actual disposition change. As we just touched on, your own reputation level doesn't increase or decrease others' dispositions. That said, higher reputation does indirectly improve dispositions. Rather than scaling your dispositions higher, your reputation instead makes your persuasion attempts easier and more effective. Persuasion allows you to influence the disposition of an NPC through use of your Speechcraft and mercantile skills. Dispositions will always be raised by a minimum of 10 points, unless starting from 0, which gets you a 9-point increase. Anyways, as we go over each form of persuasion, I'll have on-screen formulae specific to each form. We'll delve into them further in just a bit. Admire raises disposition on success and lowers disposition on failure. Intimidate works similarly, but there's 2 key differences. The first is that Intimidate factors in your character level, which we'll cover in just a bit, and the second is that Intimidate successes raise NPC flee chance and lower NPC fight chance. If you can somehow initiate conversation with a hostile NPC, like with a calm spell, you can sometimes convince them to stop attacking once the spell effect wears off. Mind you though that in some cases it may take a significant amount of intimidation. And once you're through with it all, they don't exactly leave combat with you, rather they just run from you. But hey, it's something you can do. Taunt works inversely compared to Intimidate. On success, disposition is lowered, flee chance is lowered, and fight chance is raised. You can use taunting to legally fight and kill NPCs. In Morrowind, murder is legal so long as you didn't initiate combat. It's worth noting that there is an extremely low chance, if you have poor Speechcraft and personality, failing to admire an NPC can actually provoke them to attack as well. The last form of persuasion is bribery. As you might expect, bribery works similar to admire, only you're paying an NPC for money in exchange for higher disposition. Larger amounts of money grant higher success chances and higher amounts of disposition being gained on success. There's a couple things to note on bribery, though. While bribery does take into account your mercantile skill, it instead levels your speechcraft on success. The other thing is that bribery works very well in tandem with taunting. As we went over, it's usually a little easier to succeed at persuasion around the 50 to 60 disposition range. So you can bribe an NPC up to about that range, maybe a little more, and begin taunting them. Repeat this until they attack, and once they're dead, you can loot back your gold from their corpse. What this means is that, with enough money, you can kill anybody that you want. So, as I said, as we've been covering these forms of persuasion, I've been throwing up various related formulae used in calculating them. As is often my approach, I want to cover the parts of these formulae that are relevant to us while playing, because it's just ridiculous to expect anyone to plug in numbers while playing. So, in each formula, you'll notice a target variable. On screen now is what they represent. NPC rating, of course, utilizes NPC stats, and player rating uses your own stats. Target 1 is used by admire and taunt. Target 2 is used by intimidate. Target 3 is used by bribe. The usual suspects are at play here too. Personality, luck, and the fatigue modifier all play their usual roles. If you want better success at persuasion, increasing your speechcraft or mercantile of bribing is most important, followed by your personality and then your luck. As always, keep your fatigue topped off for the 1.25 times fatigue modifier. Now, what's worth noting is just how big of a role character level and reputation play where they're used. For our own character, we can see that reputation is weighted equally to our speechcraft skill, and our character level isn't subjected to the fatigue modifier. While we can't exactly focus on leveling those stats in particular, it essentially means that as we continue playing the game, persuasion just naturally grows easier for us. Finally, let's flip back to the formula used in each type of persuasion for just a moment. Take a look at the X and Y variables here. These are what's ultimately used when determining your disposition changes after attempting persuasion. On screen now is precisely what these two variables are ran through. Your individual persuasion attempts are considered temporary disposition changes. The accumulative result of all your temporary disposition changes are then ran through the permanent disposition change formula. At the end of the day, though, this information isn't useful to us, really, from a player perspective. What's important is knowing what goes into the success or failure checks for each form of persuasion, which we already covered. Alright, that ought to do it for disposition and persuasion in Morrowind. Despite needlessly complicated and, in some cases, buggy coding, the mechanics of the system is simple enough to wrap your head around, and get more out of it if you're so inclined. Anyways, be sure to check out my other Morrowind guide videos. I'm sure you'll find something interesting if you haven't looked already. I've also got a weekly Morrowind playthrough going on maximum difficulty. Check it out if you're into that sort of thing. Thanks again for watching. Peace.